Good evening. Thank you all for being here. I know there are lots of other things that you could be going to see and listen to. Two big economic trends define our age of discontent. Slower growth and increasing inequality. The proceeds of progress are smaller than before, and they're increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few who don't always deserve their excessive gains. And the upshot is that median wages, the incomes of average people, have stagnated or fallen across the Western world. And of course, Greece is an extreme example of this. The gains from earlier catch-up growth have been lost during the crisis, and the incomes of average people, and indeed the poor, have plunged even faster than the economy as a whole. But it's also true in my own country, Britain, which has experienced the second largest fall in real wages since the crisis, or indeed in the United States, where median incomes have stagnated for decades. And all this at a time when millionaires, multi-millionaires, billionaires and multi-billionaires are proliferating and indeed prospering. Now, an acquaintance of mine who works for NetJets, which rents out private jets, said that business in Greece was booming throughout the crisis. So contrary to what a former UK finance minister once said, we are not all in it together. Now, of course, some of the problem, and in the case of Greece, a large part of it is due to the financial crisis, and in particular to the post-crisis policies, the misguided pro-creditor response, which prioritised bank bailouts and austerity instead of debt restructuring and policies to support demand. But it's not just about the crisis. It's also a longer-term structural trend across the Western world of slower productivity growth, low investment, increasing insecurity, weak demand even at the peak of the economic cycle, and the use of debt to try and patch over the cracks. Now, of course, this economic crisis is also a political one, because the long-standing promise that politicians made, which was that each generation would be richer than the last, has been broken. And many Europeans, indeed many Americans, fear that the future will be worse. To paraphrase the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, they think that young people's lives will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and long. And many citizens feel that they no longer have a stake in society, that the system is rigged against them by entrenched elites who are incompetent and unaccountable, self-serving and corrupt. And that, of course, is a big reason for why Syriza won here in 2015, why Brexit won in Britain, why Trump won in the United States. And it's a big reason why there's a disenchantment not just with national elites, but indeed with EU technocratic establishment. So the big question then is, what can we do about it? And for me, the starting point is that governments need to stop making the situation worse. You know, I wrote a whole book about this called European Spring, Why Our Economies and Politics Are in a Mess and How to Put Them Right. And I think the key messages which I wrote back in 2014 still hold true today. So first, governments need to stop making the situation worse. At a time when demand remains weak, governments should be pursuing expansionary policies, not austerity. And they should be redistributing more, not squeezing the incomes of the poor and stifling their life chances. Now, the problem, of course, in the Eurozone is that we have deflationary policies baked into the EU treaties. We have an excessively independent Germanic European Central Bank, and we have excessively austere fiscal rules. But even in the Eurozone, there is scope for a Green New Deal that combines investment and reform, where the proceeds of carbon taxes are used to pay green dividends to every citizen, so that the fight against climate change isn't at the expense of the poor. Second, we need structural reforms, progressive structural reforms that make the economy both more dynamic and more fair. I think here in Greece there's lots that can be done to make public administration, indeed the legal system, both more efficient and more fair. And across the Western world, we need to address the excessive growth of the rent-seeking financial sector, which extracts value from the real productive economy and doesn't even do its job of allocating capital properly. And we need to address the increasing dominance of the economy by big monopolistic companies that stifle competition and that capture outsized profits. And my third and final point, though, is about politics. Because at the heart of our economic and political crisis is a feeling of disempowerment of ordinary citizens. Ordinary citizens who were told that there is no alternative to a grotesquely unfair and dysfunctional status quo. But there are always alternatives. The problem is that some of them are worse. And the tragedy is because of the failure of mainstream progressive politicians in Europe and indeed the United States to put forward positive alternatives, has opened the door to far-right nationalists like Donald Trump, Matteo Salvini and Nigel Farage, who wrongly blame all of society's problems on immigrants, or say that Brexit somehow is the way for people to take back control. And that, of course, in turn creates an incentive for other mainstream politicians to echo the rhetoric and the policies of the far right. So what progressive politicians need to do instead is to channel that discontent into positive and constructive alternatives. And that requires political mobilization, and it requires a battle of ideas. Because none of the changes that I mentioned are likely to happen unless we first address the underlying problem, that politicians and technocratic policymakers are far too often captured by bad ideas, by powerful vested interests, and by dysfunctional institutions. Economic change requires political change. Fresh ideas, positive alternatives, and the empowering of citizens at every level, local, national, and European.